And again, thanks to Jack, because he has stepped in rather last minute, again, with one of our speakers having to pull out due to personal reasons. So, Jack, thank you ever so much for joining us. Jack is best known as the producer of the Panentheists Philosophy podcast, one of the UK's most popular higher education podcasts. He's also the editor of Talking About Philosophy book series, which features contributions from some of the world's most influential thinkers. His books include Philosophers on Consciousness, talking about the mind, Philosophers on God, talking about existence, Defeating the Evil God's Challenge in Defense of God's Goodness, and upcoming, he has Philosophers and How to Live, talking about morality. And this year he was named as the BBC New Generation Thinker. So we're very much looking forward to hearing Jack on multiverse panentheism. And without any further ado, Jack, I will hand over to you. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy to step in for Andre for this talk. Very big shoes to fill, but I'll do my very best. I think, have we got until, are we doing 45 minutes for the talk, maybe half an hour for questions, or would you like that
you've got
slightly?
75 minutes, so it's however you would like to
Fantastic.
split that. We are flexible here, so talk for as long as you like.
Great stuff. So I'm going to be speaking today about multiverse panentheism. It's a view that not many people, if anyone's, defending at the moment, and the case I'm going to make is that it's worth defending, that people have been wrong to neglect it. And here's just the latest literature on it straight away. You can see already, and this is what I'll be speaking about today. I'm going to kick off talking about multiverse panentheism, giving the motivations for the view. The only person who's defended multiverse panentheism but actually rejects it in the very same paper is Yujin Nagasawa. So he's written about this 3 times. I've got a paper forthcoming in Religious Studies which responds to Nagasawa's argument against multiverse panentheism. I'll be speaking about what that solution looks like as the main body of the presentation before getting to think a little bit more about what some of the other divine attributes of God might look like given our response to the multiverse problem of evil. I'm going to try and hide them. Right, so let's jump into multiverse panentheism. So I want to begin by making the case for thinking that God would be identical to the totality of universes or the totality of worlds. It's a God which we're all proper parts of, and that every other universe that exists in the multiverse or across modal reality makes up a proper part of God as well. So how do we reach that view? What's the motivation for thinking it? Well, obviously there are lots of motivations given by contemporary science, whether it's an eternal inflation model of the universe, where from Big Bang onwards we have an internal inflation and lots of bubble universes pop up as this inflation goes along. We could have a view of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, defended by people like Sean Carroll, in which the wave functions constantly developing in line with the Schrödinger equation and giving us an uncountable number of worlds. So there are approaches within contemporary physics that give us, and cosmology that give us multiverse views. But the view that I want to give here is a religious motivation for thinking that the multiverse hypothesis is true. So I begin with the perfect being thesis. The perfect being thesis states that God is the greatest possible being. You know, in Anselmian language, there's nothing greater that can be conceived. According to Catherine Rogers and Yujin Nagasawa, they know of nobody who has defended a concept of God which is anything less than perfect. As we'll see, this isn't quite true. John Stuart Mill defends a God of limited powers. Philip Goff defends a God of limited powers. May Sinclair develops a view of God where God isn't quite as omniscient as one would hope. But these are the outliers. There are very, very few examples. I'm interested to know if anyone knows any people beyond those 3 cited. The overwhelming number, the consensus amongst theists and theologians, is that if God exists, then God is perfect. And what does it mean to be perfect? Well, it means you hold all great-making properties to the highest possible degree. There are four types of great making properties, and the fourth one is what I say God has to the highest possible degree. There are things that it's great for oneself, some properties that might be great for yourself. For example, um, it's it's great for me to it's great for me to be punctual, right? So I'm here for the talk this morning. It's something that's great for the universe and others. It's great for a doctor to be compassionate, something that's great in the context of one's character or capacity. So it's great for a knife to be sharp, but it's not great for a staircase to be sharp, right? It's only great in relation to its other properties. Now, when we say that God holds all great making properties to the highest possible degree, what people mean is that God holds intrinsic great making properties, things that are good for the sake of themselves. And why? Well, one, it marks the realization, like the fulfillment of the great making property. And two, it allows us to have a cross-entity comparison between radically different things about their value. You know, how do we compare aardvarks and escalators? How do we compare knives and staircases? Well, we can compare them by their intrinsic great making properties, and thus we can compare God to all of these things as well. And God would sit at the top of this chain of being. So that's all non-controversial stuff. This is what perfect being theologians have thought for an awful long time and continue to think now. And when they're trying to figure out which the great making properties are, which the intrinsic great making properties should be ascribed, should be given to God, they often consult their intuitions through thought experiments. And Nelson Pike gives a great example, which is helpful here. He gives the game of two doors. So you might know this one already. He says, imagine there are two doors, and on the front of each door is written the name of a property. So on one door it could say powerful, and the other door it says not powerful. And you've got to decide whether or not to destroy one object and save the other. So you're given a choice between saving an object that the only thing you know about it is that it's conscious, and the only thing you know about the other object is that it's not conscious. And the overwhelming majority of people say, I'd save the conscious thing over the not conscious thing for the sake of itself, knowing nothing else about it. They say the same about the entity being powerful. They say the same about it being knowledgeable, good. And here comes the radically different great making property that I want to introduce here, encompassing. So perfect being theologians traditionally accept the first four. And what I argue is that I think they should also take the fifth one seriously and accept the fifth one as a great making property if they think the first four are great making properties. So let's think about encompassment. So God would have to be conscious, powerful, knowledgeable, good, and encompassing. So what does it mean for God to be encompassing? Very briefly, before I answer that question, these are just some of the motivations that are given for believing that God is powerful, knowledgeable, and good, i.e. why people take these to be great making properties. All of these are taken from Daniel Hill from various stages, who working in perfect being theology. People are trying to expend their power. We admire the knowledgeable. You know, we think it's valuable to know whether there's life on Mars thousands of years ago, even if it didn't affect our lives here. It's just something good to know for the sake of itself. And he says in relation to Pike's game, he'd save the morally good thing over that which is not morally good. So in order to motivate encompassment as a great making property, we need to make the comparative claim that if these are good reasons for taking these properties to be great making, then we need something similarly as reasonable in favor of encompassment. So why would we take encompassment to be a great making property? Well, first, let's define encompassment. Some encompassment is how much of existence some entity encompasses, how much it covers, and how long an entity encompasses that aspect of existence. And I think this is a great making property that we recognize in our day-to-day lives. Like, think about some of these landmarks like the Great Barrier Reef or the Great Ocean Road, the Great Wall of China. These things are valuable for the sake of themselves because of how long they are, like how long they last and how big they are. Like the Great Ocean Road is great because it's a big road. The Great Wall of China is great because it's a very long wall that's existed for a long period of time. So I think this is something we recognize about things that we want to save in our culture as well. Like think of like really old trees, or like things with history, or great momentous statues and the like. Like when it comes to things that are a relatively small size, like we don't typically value large people over more skinny people and the like, because there's such a small difference between them. But there's something valuable in the sake of itself for something that has a long history and spans across large swathes of existence. And so if you think that's reasonable, if you think that we do value things for their scope and their longevity, then, and well, let me put that a bit more clearly. If you think that's just as reasonable as believing that these things are great making properties, like if you think it's reasonable to think that knowledge is good for the sake of itself, or that being powerful is good for the sake of itself, then when you look at these landmarks and you look at things in the world with longevity and large scope, then you should also think the same about them. So let's make the comparative claim here. I won't go through all the premises. It's far too early in the morning to be going through reading, doing PowerPoint karaoke, so we'll avoid that. But the point here is just, if you think that power, knowledge, goodness, and consciousness are great making properties, then there is similarly reasonable evidence for thinking that encompassment is a great making property. And so if encompassment is also a great making property, then God must be the most powerful, knowledgeable, good, conscious, and encompassing being that can be conceived. What Yujin Nagasawa does from here then, he suggests that encompassment is a great making property. And from there, he says, quote, God's complete comprehensiveness, its capacity to encompass all of reality, represents God's ultimate significance. And he thinks then that this would result in a view, something like modal realism, or something like a vast multiverse. Think about typically how these properties of God are arrived at in the history of perfect being theology, right? You start off with power's a great making property, God's the best being, so God would have power to the highest possible degree, i.e., you derive an extraordinary property such as omnipotence from the perfect being thesis and from thinking that power is great. In the same way, I'm suggesting that if you think encompassment is a great making property, you can plug that into the definition of God and get out of that a vast multiverse. So if God's the greatest encompassing being, then you should posit the existence of an uncountable number of worlds or universes which would be part of God's nature. Where are we? Multiverse panentheism. So I think the multiverse panentheism offers comparative advantages over other types of theism, in line with Michael Almeida and people like Yujin Nagasawa. It gives you answers to the questions of fine-tuning, best possible world, the arbitrariness of our world coming into existence at some certain point in time. It's important to clarify here as well that often this view is mistaken as thinking that the multiverse exists and then you point to the multiverse and go, that's the biggest thing, and therefore that must be God. That's not the way this is spelled out. It's quite the opposite. As I said a moment ago, the reason you should believe in the multiverse is because God is the greatest encompassing being, and therefore you should posit them as part of God's nature. Why is this panentheism? Well, it's trivially panentheism. It's not really panentheism. You could call it pantheism if you like. Traditional pantheism takes our actual world or universe to be identical to God. But within multiverse panentheism or modal panentheism, we want to say panentheism because God transcends our world in a fairly weak sense, but God transcends our world by encompassing all other worlds or universes. So the universe is in God, as God is the sum of all universes. And why think that these universes are concrete rather than abstract entities? Well, as Anselm tells us, it's greater to exist in reality than it is just in the mind. So you could imagine a view where God, he encompasses our world, or maybe is separate from time and space, but he has all of the worlds and universes in his mind. And you might think that's just as vast of a thing as if God encompassed all of actual space and time and modal reality. But if Anselm's right and it's better to exist in reality than it is in the mind, then we should take these entities to be concrete, i.e. these universes or these worlds. All right. There's a big problem that this view faces, though, which is the multiverse problem of evil. As I said, Nagasawa develops this view, multiverse panentheism, and rejects it within the space of the same article. He points out that it has lots of advantages over other types of theism. But then he says we should actually favor traditional theism, the God of traditional Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, over the multiverse panentheistic interpretation of God, because he thinks the modal problem of evil against the multiverse problem of evil against multiverse panentheism is a significantly greater problem than the traditional problem of evil is against traditional theism. So if multiverse panentheism is true, Nagasawa thinks that every possible universe would include every possible instance of evil. So what you'll have is an enormous number of universes or worlds where children are being tortured for their whole lives and people are being forced to watch Adam Sandler movies on repeat. There are going to be lots of amazing worlds as well where it's nothing but bliss and happiness for everybody. But the question is, how can God be perfectly good and embody such a substantial number of evil worlds or universes? So he runs the structure of the problem like this. So I'll just again run through some of the highlights. God's perfectly good and encompasses all possible universes. And the third premise says that there exists a significant or infinite amount of evil across these universes. And therefore, perfect being panentheism ought to be considered false, because perfect being panentheism says that God must be perfectly good. All right. Let's get into the solutions then. So again, the reason there is that the traditional problem of evil only has to deal with actual evil in our world, and that's what the traditional theist faces. But the modal or the multiverse panentheist has to deal with every possible evil across all of the multiverses or worlds. So they face a more significant version, a more substantial amount of evil or types of evil that they have to reconcile their God with. So Nagasawa says, let's just stick with traditional theism. So I want to offer two solutions to this problem. One is taken from Nagasawa himself, and one is taken from other scholars in the tradition of traditional theism. Now, this argument from Nagasawa, I take from him amongst his papers on multiverse panentheism. So I believe it's 2014 and 2016, his first two papers on this. And then in 2017, his fantastic book, Maximal God, comes out. And in that, he develops it's found in Plantinga and Daniel Hill and some other scholars in the past. But in that book, he gives the most developed argument for a different type of perfect being theology, which he calls the maximal God thesis. So Nagasawa says that perfect being theologians have made a crucial mistake in thinking that they should interpret the claim that God is perfect as God having the omni properties. That he thinks if God's perfect, that doesn't commit somebody to thinking that God would have to be omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. You can actually interpret the perfect being thesis, i.e. God's the holds all great making properties to the highest possible degree. You could hold that in line with a second interpretation, the maximal God thesis. And according to the maximal God thesis, rather than God possessing individual great making properties to the highest possible degree, power, knowledge, goodness, and the like, God only has to possess the maximal consistent set of great making properties. And to quote him directly, he says, while God is certainly very knowledgeable, very powerful, and very benevolent, he might or might not be omniscient, omnipotent, or omnibenevolent. So there are lots of arguments, obviously, against the traditional concept of God. Those internal to one of God's properties, such as like the paradox of the stone against God's omnipotence, the problem of divine sin. Like, does God have the power to sin? And obviously arguments from facts about the world, hiddenness and evil going against one or more of God's attributes. And in the face of these problems, Nagasawa thinks you can simply limit your understanding of one of God's properties. So say the paradox of the stone was actually an argument against omnipotence. I don't obviously no one really thinks it is anymore, but let's just take that as an example. So God would have to be then slightly less powerful than omnipotent given this problem, but he'd still be the greatest being. He'd still have the greatest metaphysically and logical consistent set of great making properties, because there couldn't be a being that can create a stone so heavy he himself can't lift it. So God would be the maximum of these things. He'd have them to the highest conceivable, coherent, possible degree. And I think the modal panentheist can do the same thing. The modal panentheist, or the multiverse panentheist. So I keep using modal and multiverse synonymously. We can talk about that later if you like, but I often just flip between them. The multiverse panentheist can use this too. The multiverse panentheist can say that God has all of his great making properties, and in terms of having a consistent set of them. So God might not be perfectly good or all encompassing. And in response to the modal or the multiverse problem of evil, then you can restrict God's encompassment or God's moral character. So say you valued God's goodness more than you valued God's encompassment, then you could say that God doesn't encompass evil worlds. And if you believed in the existence of evil worlds, then you could give some other explanation for what constitutes those worlds. Or say you valued God's encompassment more than God's goodness, you could say that all of the worlds which God encompasses do include evil as well, but God's greater in virtue of encompassing those evil worlds than not. Now, you might not be happy with either of those two avenues, right? It still seems to run against our intuitions or our feelings about what kind of attributes God would have to have. But notice then that would be no more of a problem for traditional theists as it would be multiverse panentheists, i.e., my fundamental claim is that multiverse panentheism is no less reasonable than traditional theism. So if you don't like the maximal God solution, then the critic has to say why they don't like the maximal God solution for panentheism and why they prefer it in the case of traditional theism. The second solution that I offer is the claim fundamentally that evil universes aren't possible universes. No, you don't have to rely on the first solution I just gave about maximal God for this one. This is a separate solution in its own right, although it's compatible with the first one. And the argument, simply put, is that if God exists, then God's essential goodness and essential encompassment will rule out the possibility of evil universes. We find similar responses in the literature on traditional theism as well. Richard Swinburne tells us that it's not logically possible for God in any world to do a morally wrong action. Philip Goff tells us it's metaphysically necessary that there's no universe in which God tortures children for fun, as this would be inconsistent with God's perfect goodness. And in the same way, I'm suggesting that if God encompasses all universes or worlds, then it's not logically or metaphysically possible for God to be made up of gratuitous evils. And I think this is fundamentally where the problem arises. Just to illustrate the point, I've put to the left the existing model, which is, I think, the schema which Nagasawa follows and how he arrives at the multiverse problem of evil. So Nagasawa says, hey, here's the perfect being thesis. God must be fully encompassing, which gives you a type of modal realism or multiverse view. But God is also supposed to be perfectly good. and then you face the multiverse problem of evil. I don't think that's the right way to approach it, and we can avoid the problem by thinking about how we should derive these universes or worlds from the perfect being thesis. So the perfect being thesis says that God's perfectly good and is fully encompassing, and you should define the universes that come out of the perfect being thesis in line with all of God's divine attributes and not just one of them. So it would be a mistake to go, God must be fully encompassing and therefore the multiverse exists because it's the greatest, vastest metaphysical structure we could hope for. And then, but God's supposed to be perfectly good. There's lots of evil in these worlds. We have a problem. When you're positing the existence of these worlds, you should do so in line with God's other properties and not just God's encompassment. So if God's fully encompassing and God's perfectly good, then we have a multiverse in which God encompasses all of them and they all reflect God's perfect goodness. And hence you'll avoid the multiverse problem of evil. There you go. I've just been over that, so we won't recap. We can just look at the nice graphic for a moment. Okay. So I think given those two solutions, modal or multiverse panentheism ought to be taken no less seriously than traditional theism. We've been wrong to neglect multiverse panentheism on account of the multiverse problem of evil, because it seems like the multiverse problem of evil is actually no more of a problem than the problem of actual evil is for traditional theism. We can offer two solutions, borrowing from the literature on traditional theism, and say that God doesn't have to encompass all these worlds, or God's not perfectly good, or evil universes aren't possible universes. And all three of those solutions would show that the multiverse problem of evil isn't a significant problem for multiverse panentheism. So off the back of that, I've started thinking about some of the other divine attributes, because as I say, the view's been neglected since Nagasawa's multiverse problem of evil. And so nobody to date, at least, has been thinking or writing about the other divine attributes on multiverse panentheism. So I've started doing some writing on power, knowledge, and consciousness, and I'll just use power as an example here and maybe touch on the other two attributes in Q&A, or if it proves interesting in this section here anyway as a side point. So we typically think of divine power as a great making property and perfect being theology. We think that it contributes to the greatness of an entity, all of things being equal, and that we understand such power to correspond to the number and type and variety of states of affairs that a being can bring about. So the more state of affairs you can bring about and the wider variety of the state of affairs you can bring about, the greater your power is. And an omnipotent being, as from Aquinas onwards, perfect being theologians would say that an omnipotent being is able to bring about any logically or metaphysically possible state of affairs. They can meet any logically or metaphysically possible input conditions. So our question is, how should this divine attribute be interpreted in line with multiverse panentheism? Well, as I said, God's identical on modal or multiverse panentheism with the totality of possible worlds or universes. And so across all of these universes or worlds, what you'll find is that every single metaphysically and logically possible power will be exercised by some proper part of God. If it's possible to exercise that power, then in one of these universes or worlds, one of these powers will be exercised. Therefore, across the concrete multiverse, across the multiverse, God will perform every logically and metaphysically possible action. Some part of God will. And I think this gives us, again, advantages over traditional theism, or other types of theism, rather. So on standard pantheisms, God's power is confined to the laws of nature in the actual world. So anything that happens in our world or our universe would be a power which God exercises or is able to exercise. But on multiverse panentheism, there are going to be a substantial, there's going to be lots of different, if you take a view of the multiverse as Nagasawa does, where everything possible happens across the multiverse, then you would say that there are going to be different laws of nature in some of them. They're going to be, if they're coherent, they're going to be Greek gods in these other universes. And so what you'll find is that God's powers are substantially greater on multiverse panentheism because God is able to perform other actions which a standard pantheism wouldn't allow God to perform, because God would be confined to the laws of nature in the actual world. Similarly, the God of multiverse panentheism is significantly greater than the gods of John Stuart Mill and more recently argued by Philip Goff, who take God to be a being with limited powers, and they limit God's power because of the problem of actual evil. So given the problem of evil, Goff and Mill say, well, maybe God doesn't have all the powers, i.e. the powers to act outside of the laws of nature, and that's why evils exist. But on multiverse panentheism, you're going to have worlds in which there are no evils, that there's no lower order evils that give rise to higher order goods. In fact, what you'll find is that God is able to exercise the power to have evil-less worlds, and therefore God has more powers than Mill or Goff allow, again, because they confine God to the laws of nature. And if you took a traditional concept of God and the maximal God thesis and you limited God's goodness because of the problem of evil, the same thing would follow again. So that's a Nagasawa version of Mill and Goff. And probably lastly, and this one's not much more of perhaps this isn't much more of an interesting comparison in terms of God's power, but more of one about God's goodness and creativity. On traditional theism, God has every single logically and metaphysically possible power available to them, but only exercises a limited subset of those powers. But on multiverse panentheism, God exercises every single logically and metaphysically possible power. So although, we define power in terms of input conditions, i.e. being able to meet them, and so God's power remains the same on multiverse panentheism as it does traditional theism. But there is something interesting there in that God satisfies what we might call the principle of plenitude, i.e. if God has a responsibility to create or constitute every worthwhile state of affairs, every good world, every creatively unique world, then it seems like multiverse panentheism holds an advantage. You could ask the traditional theist the question, if God could create or constitute a substantial or infinite number of good universes, why has God only constituted or created our actual universe? Again, there's a problem here, though, in terms of God's power. On multiverse panentheism, all of the powers in the world are God's world, but as we know, some of our powers are exercised towards evil. So this is more intimate than the traditional problem of actual evil, which asks why God would permit evil to exist. This question asks how God could actively himself exercise power to bring about evil states of affairs. And this might actually provide a reason for favoring traditional theism. So the argument would go something like this. The first premise says that all powers exercised within the actual universe are God's powers. Some of those are exercised towards evil. And therefore, the fifth point says, derived from premises 3 or 4, that God cannot be perfectly good given that. Right, so I offer two solutions to this problem. The first is to say, they're both denying the difference between traditional theism and modal panentheism, that you can, again, borrow from the solutions that have been given by traditional theists and incorporate them within multiverse panentheism. So the first one is more deterministic. The first solution I offer says that there are no such things in the actual world, the actual universe, or any other universal world. There are no evils that are gratuitous. That every single evil that we encounter is a lower order evil, which is required in order to have some higher order good that outweighs the lower order evil. So you need some harm for forgiveness, you need hurricanes for hurricane relief funds and the like. And what you'll find is that all of the powers that God exercises through our actual universe and any other universe, all the powers exercised by God are never towards a type of evil that's incompatible with God's goodness. It's always an evil, in quotation marks, that cashes out in the form of some good. A second solution might be as follows: a libertarian model in which there are agents whose choices are undetermined by the powers in the world. This classic definition of libertarian free will is that your actions aren't determined by these prior powers or causes, and that you have this freedom of the will, this power or choice to do otherwise, that is better described as your power than God's power. So free will emerge as a product of divine power. God will constitute the fundamental constituents of you, the agent who makes the decision, but ultimately and fundamentally, the decision's going to be yours. Now, saying that out loud, I'm not entirely convinced by it. But again, the question we have to ask is, how is this different on traditional theism if there's a problem here? So the problem I foresee here is that if all powers are God's powers, and God is supposed to have all powers because God is omnipotent, then how can there be some other power that isn't God's? But notice this is very similar to the paradox of omnipotence on traditional theism, where it's asked whether God could create agents which he doesn't have power over. Like if there's libertarian free will and I have a power that God cannot possess, it's a logically and metaphysically possible power because I possess it, but in virtue of my free will, God can't possess it. So the problem there for traditional theism is whether God can be omnipotent and allow for free will. And the same sort of thing is running here in terms of multiverse panentheism. If all the powers are God's powers, then how can there be a power that isn't controlled or exercised by God? So if you think that there's a parallel and those two arguments against the two positions are roughly as reasonable, then my fundamental thesis that multiverse panentheism shouldn't be neglected in favor of traditional theism still follows. I could say a couple of things on God's knowledge regarding the same sort of thing here. I'll just add this as a last note. So if God, a similar thing would follow in terms of divine knowledge on multiverse panentheism. So we typically take God to know everything that's logically or metaphysically possible for God to know, which includes propositional knowledge, a list of all the things, all the propositional facts about the world or otherwise. Experiential knowledge is often a problem for traditional theism as well, in that whether or not God could know what it's like to surf a wave or fall off a bicycle. And a lot of theists will say that's not something God could know. And indexical knowledge, like I am sat in a chair watching this presentation at 10 a.m. Like those, and again, the indexical and experiential knowledge seems to be a problem for God. But on multiverse panentheism, it seems like you can have the indexical and the experiential knowledge because all knowledge is God's knowledge. And you also have the propositional knowledge because across all the universes, you're going to have all the propositional knowledge being known. And I raise this just to say, okay, there's going to be benefits to knowledge as well, but you're going to have a similar problem with knowledge as the problem of evil powers. You're going to have the problem of we have knowledge of evil in the sense of knowledge of what it's like to be a perpetrator or agent of evil doing some wrong onto another. So God knows what it's like to torture children, for example, and God has the indexical knowledge that he is the person who is torturing children at this moment in time. And that seems to be incompatible with God's perfect goodness as well. And I think you have to run a similar defense of it here. You're going to have to say that I think the best solution is going to be something like all the knowledge that God could have, although God might suffer in that knowledge or taken in isolation, that knowledge might be seen as a bad, that it's necessary for bringing about some greater state of affairs in the future, so bringing about a greater good through some form of theodicy or defense, which on the ground looks like a lower order evil generating some higher order good. So one's knowledge of what it's like to do something dreadful to another being will give rise to some future knowledge or some future state of affairs which outweighs the knowledge of the evil. All right, okay, sorry for the little detour there at the end. Concluding remarks. I don't think it's any less reasonable to believe that God is encompassing than it is to believe that God's powerful, knowledgeable, or conscious, and that will give you multiverse panentheism. We can solve the multiverse problem of evil through the maximal God approach, or by saying that evil universes aren't possible universes. And it seems that multiverse panentheism can accommodate omnipotence, some kind of divine power, and we can offer some promising solutions to the problem of evil powers as well. All right, cool. Well, we'll do some questions and answers. If anyone's still conscious at this ungodly hour, I'll drop my slide there. I'll leave these slides up and I'll just have a little look and see what we have elsewhere. Brilliant. In the chat and the like.
Thanks, Jack. Really appreciate that. I know a lot to process at this time in the morning, so I think quite a few of us are going to be coming back to the recording and possibly picking up with you after this. But we do have some questions in the chat. I think some of them are sort of clarifications in a lot of senses. So they're all coming in now, so I'm trying to type more slowly, people. Right, so Andrew has said that he doesn't understand, and what I'll do is if I run through these and then you can probably respond to them en masse. I don't understand why encompassing as a great making property should entail a multiverse according to panentheism. Panentheism means creation is in some way in God, though God can still be greater than or different from creation. So if God's being is all encompassing, would it, hang on, so God's being all encompassing would not necessitate a maximum possible creation, i.e. a multiverse. Surely only with pantheism do perfect being arguments apply equally to creation, since creation is God. And kind of related to that, Paul said, could you say a bit more on why encompassment should be considered a great making property? Because it doesn't prima facie appear obvious that it should. And then we'll come to the other two, I think. Those two seem.
Okay. Thank you. They're good questions. Let me just read this part again. Panentheism means creation is in some way in God, through God can still be greater than or different from creation. Yeah, I suppose I'm happy with that, Andrew. And as I said, I'm happy for it just to be called pantheism, and maybe that answers your question. The in is quite trivial there, right? The actual universal world is in God because God transcends it by encompassing other universes or worlds. Do you want to come back on that, Andrew?
Yes, thank you. I agree with you that then if pantheism is a better term, because then all the great making properties automatically apply to the world because the world is God. It's either or, it's the same, it's a synonymous thing. Whereas panentheism reserves a difference to allow God to have all these great making properties, but not necessarily to instantiate them in creation, because creation is a free act that could well be far less than God himself.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so just to be clear, though, I want to say that there is no God which is, transcendent outside of time, space, which is separate from the multiverse. Like on this view, God is the totality of universes or worlds. Like that is all God is. So there's no extra part outside of it. If you define it again, we've got lots of different views of the multiverse or modal space. But if you took the broadest possible one where everything possible happens, then there are going to be universes where you've got a timeless, spaceless mind, if that's possible, right? And so there'll be an aspect of God that's kind of like traditional theism, but you don't have, like, the world isn't created by God. Like God, the world just is God. Like, and the world exists because that's part of God's nature. Like, God ought to be concrete, God ought to be good, conscious, and the like. So yeah, in short, I'm happy to embrace pantheism as a term, but I do want to distinguish it from pantheism, and in that pantheism is traditionally conceived as, it's a weird one, right? Because pantheists are going to tell me that I'm not happy with you calling this pantheism because pantheists mean the actual world, and the panentheists are going to say, well, I think of all of concrete reality as being in God and God being transcendent in some way. So I'm going to piss everybody off, Andrew, in one way or another. So I need to I need to find some word in between them, maybe. Okay, do you want me to jump to Paul's question?
Yeah, I think, yeah, let's go on to encompassment, and then we'll come to some of the others.
Right, okay, encompassment. So encompassment is the scope, how much of existence you occupy and for how long you occupy it. So despite what my ex-wife would tell me, it does matter how big you are and how long you can last. And when it happens across all of these things in the world, such as these great monuments, these things with history, like don't cut down that great birch tree. It's 3,000 years old, right? Take a tree that's existed for 3,000 years and take a tree that's existed for 30 years. Why is one greater for the sake of itself than the other? Because one has existed for a longer period of time. And I know that sounds odd, but if you believe in intrinsic great-making properties, then I think we do flock to these enormous monuments, these great, huge objects, and we do value things that have existed for long periods of time for the sake of themselves. I struggle to think otherwise why we do value some of these objects, like why we shouldn't chop down one tree rather than the other. It seems all other things being equal, the 3,000-year-old tree has a greater value than the 30-year-old tree. I wonder if you want to come back on that, Paul, in any sense. I'm happy just for you to go. No, that works. I agree. If God has the power, does it? Oh, okay. That's a different. Maybe that's a different Paul. Do you want to go? Should we go to another question and see if Paul wants to come back at the same time?
We've got a couple of rounds of limiting power as well. So John said, if God is love, then can he choose to limit his power by allowing freedom to bring about spiritually mature creatures? And then we've also got different Paul who says, if God has all power, does this include discretion? And could power without discretion? You might have to clarify the end bit of that.
Sorry, there's a typo there. It's no, not now.
Right.
What's discretion, Paul?
A choice, essentially.
Oh, can God make decisions like behind the scenes still?
Yeah, in other words, if God has all power, presumably discretion or choice would be one of them.
Yeah.
And if God has to exercise every power, is that effectively no power?
I didn't get the last part, but let me say this brief thing and let's see if it clarifies it. So what I didn't talk about, and you're right to pull this up, is like God's unified mind and decision-making capacity, right? So I want to say consciousness is a great-making property, and so the whole multiverse will fundamentally have to have consciousness as a pervading through it, right? And that, as a unified mind, would give us the knower of the knowledge and the thing that can exercise some power. And so I want to say that God can make decisions. God does have some fundamental agency and freedom of the will, like at a fundamental level as well. Like the entity that underlies all of the universe is a unified mind that is able to push things in certain directions and the like and make decisions. Trivially, you could get rid of that and still go, well, I'm a proper part of God and I have the decision whether or not to throw my hand in the air or not. And so God has that, as a proper part of God, I can attribute the same sort of property to God. you want to come? Do you want any clarifications on that, Paul, or do you want me to jump to a?
I suppose I'm just thinking that if God has all characteristics, does God have any characteristics?
You feel
If
like
God-
in case it sort of is a cancelling out almost, Paul. That
Yes,
if he's got everything,
basically.
then it becomes sort of a nothingness,
Yes.
which I think ties in nicely because there's another question which I'm not going to be able to find from John Whittle that says if our multiverses involving contradictions, so is there like, does that then cancel? Do the contradictions in the multiverses potentially cancel each other out? And therefore, would this or would this not lead to contradictions within God, which I think kind of picks up on Paul's point. So I suppose, that's something around the paradoxicality in the metaphysics, I suppose.
Yeah. So if there's right, okay, all right, a couple of things then. Let me just let's do this one. First of all, I want to know what the contradiction was. If it's that in one world there are one set of laws of nature and in another world there are a different set of laws of nature, I don't see that sort of thing being a problem for God's knowledge or powers, right? God has the power to constitute black holes that are portals to other places, right? And God also has the power for black holes just to destroy things when they enter them, right? So we've got a similar kind of thing in two different universes that do have different laws of nature governing them, let's just say, right? And you go, okay, so there are two things, there are two different powers God's exercising. That doesn't seem to me to, it's indexical as well, right? So you've got in this world, this power does that. And in this world, God knows that. And in this other world, God has this power and knows this thing. I don't see any of those powers or that knowledge contradicting each other. Like, there can't be. No, I can't see there being a contradiction that's vicious in that way. So I'm struggling with it because I can't foresee what I want to steel man the question, but I genuinely can't feel like a contradiction that's going to be a problem.
If in one world something dies, and then in the other world it doesn't die, where something happens here and the opposite happens in the other universe, isn't there a contradiction there within God?
It's not. I wouldn't. Okay, that clarifies it. I wouldn't say that it's a contradiction. You just go, as you put it, in one universe, this thing's happened. And if you couldn't have in this universe something both dies and lives simultaneously, you could have in World 1, Jack died, and in World 2, Jack carried on living. Like that, it's not going to give the kind of contradiction that's going to be a problem for God. Now, I'll try and think of one. I think knowledge might give you a trickier set of circumstances.
I suppose the equivalent of Jack would be, can you end up in a situation where there is a universe in which there is both a thing and its negation? I think there's a question there, like a paradox in the traditional sense. And I also wonder if there's a question here around to what extent are we imagining, and I suppose this is where using the term multiverse is probably more challenging, in that, is this multiverse referring to all possible worlds that potentially aren't actualized, or are we thinking about it in a multiverse, so a sort of Everettian many worlds sense? I don't know if that makes a difference to your argument. Okay,
this is good. So, all right, just on the contradiction one then, I can just say this briefly on it, is that God, every logically and metaphysically possible world, given the complete set of worlds that's possible, would exist. So God has every logically and metaphysically possible power, propositional knowledge, experiential knowledge. And so if that knowledge was contradictory, then it wouldn't be logically or metaphysically possible, given the other thing God knows, or the powers that God has. So that wouldn't go against the definition of power, knowledge, and the like, which I've given here. The question of, yeah, this is a question I avoided, a point I avoided in the presentation for a couple of reasons. The question of what kind of multiverse we're talking about. So Nagasawa uses multiverse to mean every possible state of affairs. Like every possible way a universe could be the way a universe is. I don't know beyond even Max Tegmark's views, not quite that. I don't know a multiverse view that defends that sort of idea in the literature on physics and the like. It's much more in line with modal realism, that. But here's a couple of things you might find interesting on it. Is that first, this is a religious motivation for a multiverse view. And so our view of the multiverse doesn't need to be constrained by the current models that we have. You can posit the greatest conceivable universe in line with the perfect being thesis and end up with every logically and metaphysically possible state of affairs. But let's say you went, no, a multiverse just couldn't be like that. A multiverse can't have every logical and metaphysically possible state of affairs for reasons we've just discussed. Maybe like in one universe, one thing happens, another something else happens. That's a contradiction. Maybe you think God's mind can't extend across an infinite or uncountable number of universes in that way. Maybe they're isolated. Like there are going to be problems with some of them. If there are problems with some of them, that doesn't give us a reason to abandon multiverse or modal panentheism, or pantheism to please Paul. What it does give us is just a reason to go for a more restrictive type of universe or type of modal space. So it may well turn out that, let's say we can conceive of 100 universes, and that's as far as we can get without contradictions arising and with God's mind extending between them. And you go, okay, well, that's the greatest encompassing being that can be conceived. And so if it's not possible to be greater than 100 worlds or universes, well, that's God. But if you can, as I think we can, have an uncountable number of worlds or universes that constitute God. I'd notice I don't say infinite as well. That having an actual infinity is going to be a problem. An uncountable number of them, then I think we can defend that. So in short, the answer is, one, it's a religious motivation, so we don't need to align ourselves with a popular view in physics and the like. But two, if you really wanted to do that so people didn't think you were crazy and it seemed like a bit more of a sensible view, then you can simply restrict God's encompassment to a more limited number of worlds or universes. I skipped a question. I'm not sure how are we doing for time here.
We've got plenty of time. I suppose there's following on from that, where you're talking about it doesn't. This is kind of, I suppose, the reality is less of an issue. Taylor's asked, to what extent is the possibility of multiverses accepted by physics? She can see how the theo-philosophical argument makes sense, but does it matter if it is a physical possibility or not? I suppose, just to kind of change the question slightly.
To what extent is the possibility of multiverse accepted by physics? Yeah. I mean, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is, I'd say, a minority view, but it is defended by, notable physicists such as Sean Carroll, the inflation model of the universe. I don't know how widely accepted that is. It's typically wanted to say that the inflation slows down at some point. I suppose as I've sort of just answered the follow-up, which is that it sort of doesn't. Okay, you've asked. It sort of doesn't matter how many of them actually think it's the case, given that this argument, as you say, is theo-philosophical. But how certain are we that it's a physical possibility? I mean, if we're talking possibility and we're talking like metaphysical possibility, then I don't think there's any reason for us to think that a multiverse view isn't possible. And that's sort of, if if we've got possibility in the metaphysical sense, then that's ultimately what matters. But it's, you know, it's accepted by a bunch of notable physicists, and I think that just adds it doesn't add much. It adds a bit of weight to it, if you're that way inclined, but I don't see it as being necessary to the argument in any way. Sorry, that might be a disappointing answer. I wish I could give you like a study of how many people I think this is the case. Maybe I can look into it and try and find out how many actually do think there's some kind of multiverse.
Do you want to come back on that, Taylor?
No, I was just gonna say that's fine. Thank you.
Cheers, Taylor. Thank you.
I suppose I've got a question, Jack, in that you said that well, you seem to say that the contradiction wouldn't matter because it's about logical possibility, right? So therefore you couldn't logically hold the contradiction. Are you therefore assuming that a binary logic is correct? Because it's obviously on a non-binary or a fuzzy logic, there can be things that are both and, not either or. So does that then mean that your multiverse God is going to have to contain contradiction if you're not using binary logic?
I don't know. What kind of fuzzy logic are you thinking?
So fuzzy or multivalent logic says that things can be and or. It depends on the category in which they're being sat. So traditionally, when you talk about a contradiction, there's this assumption that something is either A or not A. And so you get the Aristotelian, you cannot be both A and not A at the same time. Whereas with multivalent logic, it is possible for something to be both and or either or. So there's a possibility for that contradiction to be logically possible. It's just changing what logic you are using. And so that's why I'm asking if you're assuming a binary logic.
That's good. I am assuming one just because I'm not a logician and I skipped my logic classes as a student. But I imagine, and I wonder what you make of this, that if there are other kind, you know, you could input any kind of coherent logic into the system as a whole, right? If fuzzy logic's not a problem, then you can.
I think fuzzy logic isn't. I think the problem it causes theologically is it does allow contradiction or metaphysical paradox technically to exist. So there's a question about, it's not so easy to go, oh well, that's logically impossible. Therefore it wouldn't reside in God. God could be both good and not good. It's not quite the right example, but it might be something it's worth exploring to see whether that you can address that, because it's not quite so easily swept under the carpet.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay, I'll make a note of it here. I think my as I say, it's my assumption, and I take it and maybe you'll agree with this, I take it I'm in the mainstream of making assumptions such as that.
I think binary logic tends to be presumed. I think it's that there is a question about, although it's disputed about whether it only applies to natural language statements, but there's been argument that even in Aristotle there's a pointing towards the fact that it also applies to things. So okay. it's probably it's a bit of a niche, multivalent logic, but I'm also not a logician, so I don't know how adopted it is in the philosophical logic sense. But yeah, it might cause you some problems, or it might not.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. I will look into it. That's really helpful. Do we have got time for one more, or do we need to?
We've got 10 minutes, so we've still got. I'm just trying to look at where we're at. So I think we're probably. So yeah, Paul came back on the idea about encompassment, and said, can we value the age of a thing without committing to encompassment? So we already consider God eternal, everlasting, which seems to cover your examples. He's not sure we value Everest because it physically takes up more space. It's more about our kind of challenge of the, there's something else to that gives it the value. So yeah, I suppose it's just coming back on you about encompassment, really, about to what extent must that be a value.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm the outlier, but I read that and go, I think we do value Everest because it's big and it takes up more space. You know what I mean? Like if I put Everest next to like a molehill, you'd go, Everest is obviously the greater of these two entities. And the only thing to explain that is because it's bloody huge. Like there's nothing else about it. Like it's just because it's big. Right. And so I think like we do think so. I was just more valuable by virtue of it being a more difficult thing to conquer. Even if you weren't able to walk and conquer or climb this thing, I think if you just by looking at it, even if you could never climb a mountain, that just simply wasn't something you were able to do. I think you'd still just looking at this thing, you'd still think it was a greater thing. It's still
yeah, I mean, Paul's
object
come
of
back and
that
said if you flattened Everest but kept the volume, you wouldn't like it. But I think there is something about this presumption that we're comparing the very great to the not so great in terms of size. So
Yeah.
is that part of the challenge, and that we're assuming that, particularly if we're going back to that the two doors, which do you keep, which don't you keep? Is it because we're assuming that there is something great on one side and something obviously less great on the other? Whereas if the choice was between, do you keep something conscious or something semi-conscious? So like perhaps if the disparity wasn't so great, would that then make this a more difficult conversation to be having?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not a perfect being theologian myself. I'm someone who works in perfect being theology. I don't believe in the truth of the perfect being thesis and the like. This argument's supposed to go, if you are a perfect being theologian, and this is the way you go about your theology, and the examples I take of conscious, not conscious, they're taken straight from Pike Hill and the like this is what they've been doing. I'm going, if you think that perfect being theology is a sensible way to arrive at a concept of God, then I don't see how it's any less reasonable to put encompassment on that same list. I'll be interested from Paul if he thinks so. It's a comparative claim, right? It's a comparative argument. I go, if you think these 3 or 4 things are great making, then why not this one? So I think you can, if you point at criticisms of encompassment, you also need to defend the greatness of these other things. Maybe Paul's happy to do that, and so hence why I'm taking the question in good faith and thinking, try and defend encompassment in its own rights. But on that, right, if you want to go, can we not value the age of thing without committing to encompassment? I think that's a more interesting question, right? Can we think that something existing for a long time would commit you to being part of concrete reality rather than being a timeless, spaceless, eternal entity, which has no end or beginning? That seems to be far greater. I think the modal panentheist can give something similar. Like there's going to be an uncountable number of these worlds, and God's existence isn't going to end. It's not going to be that these universes or worlds cease to exist. So God is going to be everlasting, maybe not eternal, but everlasting, and that gives you something similar. But you don't get the scope. You don't get there's going to be large, being outside of time and space and the like, because it's going to give you strong transcendence, but it's not going to give you, the part of encompassment which explains why. And I know you hate this example, Paul, of why Everest is great, right? It doesn't give you, like, if you're outside of time and space, you don't have size. Like that's a concept that doesn't apply to you. You don't have, you can't be measured in the scope of how much of existence you occupy. You're just like, timeless and spaceless. So you can't have that. So I haven't thought about this too much, but I think that would be my reply to it. That you might get the age, but you also get the age on modal panentheism and multiverse panentheism, but you don't get the size and the scope, and that's an important feature of encompassment.
Luca, do you want to just turn your mic on and pose your question to Jack? I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Jack, for the
Thank you, Luca.
presentation. I just my question is whether you think that what you presented is consonant with the notion of potentia dei absoluta. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but is a notion in which God can do whatever he pleases, and as you know, it's possible that in one universe there is a set of law, in another universe there is another set of law, but almost a different view, a different notion of laws that God decide to instantiate, which reflect this freedom, probably voluntaristic notion of freedom. I wanted to know what you think if this is the case, because I'm asking this question because I'm sure you're familiar of the theodicy triad, which is intelligibility, goodness, and pride. Usually what theologians say, either is evil exists, either God is not good, which is, we can refuse that, or God is powerless. Some theologians say that, or God is not intelligible. But if you are voluntaristic, you tend to deny intelligibility in God. So are you trying to imply that God is powerless in front of the evil, or is it because we cannot understand it?
Okay, good. Apologies, Luca. I think there's a bit of a connection issue for the build up of the question. I couldn't quite make out a good portion of it, but I caught the end, and if I'm understanding it right, or if I'm understanding a part of it, the question of whether the God is powerless when it comes to the existence of some evils. I don't want to say that God's powerless when it comes to evils existing. I want to say that I think the better response would be that God can clearly have I think on this view, you can have universes or worlds where there are no evils at all, nothing worthy of the label evil, right? So that's within God's power to have a universe or world which has zero evils. But God has the power as well to bring about states of affairs which have lower order evils, and they're justified by the higher order goods. And so, God, as I mentioned a moment ago, and something I didn't speak about in the presentation, that unified mind underlying the universe, I think that agency or will can bring about certain states of affairs, which includes lower order evils, and that's a decision that if it's possible that God has made that decision as a unified mind underlying a universe, then it will exist in one of these universes, and that could be ours. And I think that's fine. So God can exercise, and God does have the power to have world with or without evil. Does that answer it, Luca? It might be worth just sticking a comment in the chat there, just because I know it's still a bit laggy there. But I'd be interested to if I've missed your question, then please stick a part in the chat where I've missed, so I can think about it.
Yeah. No, I was trying to say whether the second part of my question was if you think that your notion of God is a notion of voluntaristic notion of God, given that God can instantiate different universe with different set of laws of nature.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'd say it is. I'd say it's I suppose it's in short, I know this might sound like a slippery answer, but it just depends on what's possible, right? If it's possible for God to be any way, then God will be that way. And so whatever, if it's not possible, then that sort of defines my view. So I get to sit on the fence with a lot of these questions and go, well, it might turn out that as long as we can reasonably say that God has these general attributes, then that's sort of fine. Yeah. So I think I can just sit on the fence with it. But please stick some in the chat so I can think more. I think we're running out of time there. Are we running out of time?
That is pretty much it. So unless anyone has a question that can be asked and answered in a minute. Oh, Paul, you reckon you do? Go for it then.
Yeah. If I'm in this particular world, and it's a multiverse universe, presumably it's indistinguishable from predestination, and therefore I have no moral responsibility or agency. Does God have any moral responsibility or agency? Sorry, I'm not very good at typing in the chat. I'm in Durham, by the way. I did theology there 35 years ago. But I'm a scientist originally.
Oh, brilliant! You're in Durham. You're in Durham now.
Yes, I've retired. I'm a fellow at St. John's.
Oh, brilliant! Cool. We should let's grab coffee when I'm in Durham every week. Let's go for a coffee, Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is okay. Sorry, I'm just excited about the Durham.
In other words, if I'm in my particular bit of the universe, the one I'm in now, me, it's indistinguishable from predestination.
Yeah.
And therefore I have no moral responsibility. And does God have any?
Okay, good. So two very quick things. The first is that you may well have moral responsibility in the same, I gave that libertarian response, the problem of evil powers. So you might have, there might be a view, which isn't the view I think you should take, but I can see it playing out similar to how it does on traditional theism, which will give you that choice. But I don't like that one. So let's just say another thing, which is that if you thought that a morally good act was one that brought about more goodness into existence, if you thought maximizing goodness was the thing you should do, that's trivial when it comes to the multiverse, because there are so many goods and bads across them that you're not making any kind of difference to the overall state of affairs. If every possible way a thing is the way things are, then you doing one bit of good does not change the equation in any great sense. So you don't have, your responsibilities are certainly trivial here on that kind of view. But I think God, does God have moral obligations? Yeah, God's moral obligation is, well, it's about God's nature. Like God can't choose otherwise, in the sense that God can't do something that's morally wrong. So a part of God's nature is always going to be to generate the best state of affairs within God's self. And so God's responsibility is, like, God brings about the good as part of God's essence on this view, but God can't choose between one and the other, like bad and good. It's impossible. So he doesn't have that kind of responsibility. I've made a bit of a mess of that. Maybe
I was going to say, can't we have it? There's a sort of mirror image argument, isn't there, about God doing bad things?
I'm going to interrupt. I'm sorry. I'm going to be the mean chair. What I am going to say is you can carry on this conversation during the break. But what I'd like to do is I would just like to say a huge thanks to Jack, both for stepping in and for giving us an awful lot to think about this morning. You have certainly blown up the questions in the chat. I think probably the most of the talk keynotes so far this conference. So there's lots of questions for you. So a virtual round of applause for Jack.